Welcome to the Pastor and Intern Podcast with Eric Dyer, pastor, and Will Overy, intern. On today's podcast, we will be discussing a book titled The Gospel Comes with a House Key. This is a book that discusses Christians and the doctrine of hospitality. Eric, will you give us a little background on the author of this book?
So, Dr. Rosaria Butterfield is someone who's written an interesting book that when we both read it, we really wanted to talk about it. She used to be a tenured professor at Syracuse University. She got her PhD from Ohio State University. She specialized in women's studies. And as far as like a certain field, she specialized in queer theory. So I know that's automatically going to be off-putting to some people. It might shock some people, right? She was a huge activist of the LGBT community. She had a lesbian partner and fought for lesbian rights actively. So she wrote articles not only for that type of activity, but also against certain Christian conferences like Promise Keepers and things like that. And so through her own study of the Bible and through this relationship she formed with a pastor and his wife, she got saved, which is such a radical thing. And she describes it as she lost everything except her dog. And now she's married to this guy named Kent, who is a pastor of a Presbyterian church. They foster tons of children, it seems as though. She's written not only this book, but she's written Secret Details of an Unlikely Convert and Openness Unhindered. So she's been really open with her conversion.
Right.
Those are two books that I definitely want to read. When I first saw them, I think I just kind of looked over them because they have a girly-ish cover.
Right.
But at the same time, I really want to know about her conversion. You know, I got saved when I was 7 at Vacation Bible School. She grew up in a lesbian community with a lesbian partner, got saved, her life totally changed.
Right. Complete 180.
Right. So this wasn't a Sunday school at 7. This was a almost midlife salvation from someone who has a PhD.
Right.
Not that one is better than the other, but one is certainly more shocking than the other.
Right.
And I think this really and she does a great job at introducing the concept of hospitality.
Right. Well, and so before I even get started to talk about hospitality, let me give you John Piper's definition, which is about 30 times better than what my definition would be. So John Piper says, quote, "As far back as you want to go in the history of God's people, one of the God-appointed duties of the righteous was hospitality, by which I simply mean the willingness to welcome people into your home or your apartment who don't ordinarily belong there." And so I think hospitality for Christians is such a radical concept, right? Because we use the phrases, well, home is where the heart is, or there's no place like home. Home is where our serenity is. It's where it's our comfort zone, right? We go home at the end of the day to get away from work, to get away from people. We kind of flip that switch off. And so for someone to tell me, hey, you need to actually open up your home to your neighbors to practice hospitality is such a crazy concept because we don't normally do that.
Well, especially in our own society, we have a home, right? Like we have an apartment, we have a house that a lot of people don't have in the rest of the world. And what's funny is not only do we come home and want to feel safe and by ourselves
right
after work, but we'll go to vacation for like a week, and then we come back to our home, which is basically another vacation spot.
Right.
Because we don't want to be bothered. We don't want anybody to come to our door. We just want it to be me and my family or whoever and the dog and just be safe.
Right. We want to feel safe.
We want to turn work off.
Right.
Things like that.
Right. And it's just crazy to think about because I know personally I don't practice this. I've never practiced this, regardless of where I'm at now or in the neighborhood we live in. And I just wonder how many opportunities I miss to eat dinner with a neighbor or to go mow somebody's yard or whatever it may be to practice this hospitality that she discusses in this book.
Well, and I live in a literal circle of houses, and the neighbors that I do know are the neighbors that either go to our church here at First Baptist or they are related to someone here at First Baptist. I've only lived in the community for about a year and a half, something like that, and the most hospitality that I do is for college students once a week. Not that that's bad. I love that time, but there's no other real time that we do that.
Right.
And that's not even my neighbors. These are just with college students.
Right.
So it's not even that I'm reaching out to the people that are literally on my doorstep.
Right. And I mean, I don't want you to misunderstand what we're saying. What we're not doing is shaming everybody for not doing hospitality. I don't know. I know of maybe 2 people, including the author of this book, that do this.
Yeah.
Like, this is a very, it's just a weird mindset for us to see. And I do think it's biblical.
I think so too.
And so I think it's very important for Christians to practice this idea of hospitality. And the first thing that comes to mind thinking about hospitality is the holiday Halloween, right? Because I feel like Halloween is such a good time to practice this if you haven't before, or if you just don't do this. Because a lot of times we think that Halloween is this holiday from the devil, and it's really what you make it. But what other time in the year do you have everybody in your neighborhood coming and knocking on your door, their kids or them or whatever it may be, or are you going out and knocking on everybody, if you're trick-or-treating, everybody in your neighborhood's door? You know?
Right. And if anything, if you're the one in the house giving out candy, you literally have people at your doorstep. If you're the person going to other people's doors, that's a great opportunity for you not to go trick-or-treat, oh, look how cute my kid is.
Right.
But also go, hey, my name is so-and-so, I live around the corner, or I live in the neighborhood over. It's really nice to meet you. I'd love to talk to you more. I'd love to invite you over to my house, things like that.
Right. Hey, we're having a dinner next Sunday. What a good way to invite everybody in the entire neighborhood.
Right. And it's not like you go around inviting people to church. Now, you can. I'm not saying don't do that.
Passing out tracts.
But it's a little more personal whenever you're saying, hey, come to my address, and I'm going to let you in my door, even though I know really nothing about you.
Right. Because it's like we separate church from home, when in reality, we are the church, right?
Right.
And so I don't know why we keep mentioning about flipping the switch, but I don't know a better way to describe it, is that when we leave on a Sunday afternoon, we flip that switch off, and as if we don't have to practice what we talked about in church at home. And a lot of that has to do with hospitality. I mean, it's such a great way to share the gospel instead of going to door-to-door evangelism. Not that door-to-door evangelism is bad. I think it's great and it has a purpose. But I just wonder how good it would be to have like she talks about having Sunday afternoon lunches.
Like a certain time.
Right. And everybody comes over, and it's awkward at first, right? Like, it's not going to be just everybody comes in and everybody's happy. And like I feel like it's going to be this weird time at first.
Well, even when we met with college students for that first time, that was weird.
Right.
Even when I knew all of you for quite a while, it was still weird because we were all in the room. And if it's weird with college students that I already know, how weird is it going to be with my neighbors?
Right. Who may be lost and
right.
Don't.
And not only do you get to share the gospel with people, you just get to love on them.
Right.
Feed them a meal. Give them some place to stay, some sense of community, because
right.
that's what the world's looking for. And I think this is the goal of the Butterfield book.
Right.
Is to show that Christianity cannot be separated from hospitality.
Right. And I don't think it should be. So, Eric, give us some biblical examples where we see hospitality in the Bible.
Well, I think it's not hard, first of all, but I think it's very easy to skip over. So we know the story of Mary and Martha and Lazarus and all that, but in Luke chapter 10, verse 38, we see Jesus traveling, and it says, while they were traveling, he entered a village, and a woman named Martha welcomed him into their home. Now, I know what you're thinking. You're thinking to yourself, you just ripped this out of its context, kicking and screaming, right? But the reality is that while Jesus traveled, where do you think he stayed? Did he stay on the road sleeping on the ground? Probably not. He's staying with people that he has formed relationships with.
Right.
And this is the first example of that. Now we know the story, Mary, Martha. Mary's at the feet of Jesus. Martha's in the kitchen doing all this stuff. And that's really not what I want to get into. But this is the first passage that came to my mind whenever I'm thinking about hospitality. Another one that I saw was in Acts chapter 18. And it starts in verse 1, and it reads like this. It says, after this, he left Athens and went to Corinth. And this person is Paul, by the way, where he found a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla, because Claudius had ordered all the Jews leave Rome. Paul came to them, and since they were at the same occupation, tent makers by trade, he stayed with them and worked with them. Where do you think that Paul stayed while he was evangelizing in Corinth? He stayed with these two Jews that he met.
Wait. So you're telling me that Jesus nor Paul stayed in a 5-star hotel?
No, they
with
did
all
not.
that money Paul's making off
Their
being a
youth
tent
pastor
maker.
did not bring them places where he had paid already for their stuff. No,
Right.
That's not what happened. And I think what's interesting is that we see this relationship with Priscilla and Aquila throughout the New Testament. Now, they're only mentioned a handful of times. I know
Right.
that because I studied about it in seminary. It was a really terrible decision to write a paper about Priscilla and Aquila, but I did anyway. And so then we find this passage in Romans chapter 16. We're going to start in verse 3 and go through the beginning of 5. And so he's writing this letter to the Romans to show his authenticity so that they can ask people about him. And he says, "Give my greetings to Prisca," or Priscilla, "and Aquila, my co-workers in Christ, who risked their own necks for my life. Not only do I thank them, but so do all the Gentile churches. Greet also the church that meets in their home." So not only has Priscilla and Aquila brought Paul in on his missionary journeys, but now they have a church that meets in their home. What a radical concept, a church meeting in their home. They didn't have church buildings like we used to have. Their churches were fundamentally built on hospitality.
Right.
That was how it was. Do you think they all just met and they didn't eat with one another and drink with one another and have all of this time together? I don't think so. I think that they were sitting together, breaking bread together, talking about Jesus together in their home. And some people might say, well, the church was different back then. They had homes. They didn't have buildings, blah, blah, blah. And I think you're missing the point.
Right.
The point is that they were so hospitable in their Christian life that they opened up their home to other believers. And it started with Paul, and it ended with this church. And I think that's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And I feel like that we miss that because we come to a building maybe twice a week for maybe an hour or two, and then we go home.
Right. Well, and I wonder if they did have the buildings, if they would still use the homes. And I think they would 100%.
Right.
And I wonder what they would think if they could see us now. I mean, we have, I'm sure, 10 times more lavish homes than they did.
Right.
Some of us have these big houses, maybe even smaller houses, regardless. And we don't open up our homes.
Well, I think if they were to be pulled out of their contemporary context and put into ours, they would be very shocked by how isolated we are.
Right.
Because that's where all the loneliness comes from. Loneliness rarely happens in the company of others. It happens when you're by yourself.
Right.
And the church is called to bring people into community.
Right.
And that's been a concept since Israel all the way to the church.
Right. And that doesn't just happen on Sunday morning, Sunday nights, Wednesday nights.
Right.
That should happen on Monday afternoon or Tuesday afternoon, or when somebody doesn't have enough money for their groceries, you go get that. I mean, regardless of what that is, that hospitality doesn't only happen on Sunday morning, Sunday nights, and Wednesday nights. We shouldn't only think about church and work as our only two places of interacting with people, when in actuality we spend the most time in our neighborhoods, most likely.
Right.
Well,
and this is where I don't want people to get confused. I love organized religion.
Right.
Don't get me wrong.
Right. No, I agree.
I am a Southern Baptist, born and proud, and I will be one until the end of time, I assume, God willing. And it's not as though this is totally separate. Like your church and your home and your work are not separate. No matter how much we want to separate them, they are not separate. When Paul was making tents, he was also in Priscilla and Aquila's home and also trying to actively get people to start a church. And you can see that Priscilla and Aquila, as they've moved from place to place, have been having churches in their home.
Right.
And so I think that's something that the church is not good at. So I love that we meet in organized spaces and organized times. But there's such a gaping hole in the way that we show hospitality to one another.
Right. I'm just thinking to myself here, what if, it's crazy to think, what would it be like if we had missionaries come to America or come to share in our church, and instead of the pastor being, hey, we're going to put you up in a hotel, or hey, you can come stay with me. What if a church member was just like, hey, we got an extra room, you can come hang out with us and we'll actually do stuff in our neighborhood while you're here.
It automatically means more.
Right. More memorable, more, well, like you said, it just means a lot more.
Right.
So
not that there's anything wrong with the hotel, right? Like that.
Right.
That shows that you care. You want to put them up somewhere nice and all of that. But what if we use those resources to show someone that we love them in a home of a church member who actively supports them either through giving or through prayer or through just showing up on Sundays.
Right. Right. So let's go through 3 questions really quickly. Let's just start with, so how does a pastor do this? So how do we're at church all day, we're talking to people, dealing with people all day. How in the world are we supposed to go home and not flip off that switch? Okay, it's time to relax, it's time to go to bed, it's time to spend time with my family. What helps us to not flip off that switch at the end of the day?
There's a couple things. So as a pastor, I get asked all the time, what do you do all day? What is on your calendar for the day? And I think that there's this big misunderstanding that I just work on Sundays and Wednesdays, and that's it, and that I just kind of just be on Facebook for the rest of my life, and that's not how it works. And so all day, every day, and you know this because you've been working with me for a little while now, but we have conversations with people almost constantly.
Right.
There's rarely, the only times that we don't is when we're studying for a message or we're trying to organize an event or whatever. And even then, you and me are often socializing about what we're doing. Right. So you and I are very social people. And I think that's why God called us to the church. But as a pastor, it's very hard for me because my wife is stuck at home with a 1.5-year-old and she doesn't get to see people. She gets to see that 1.5-year-old. That's who she gets to see. That's her audience. That's her person. And so when I go home, she is automatically going, hey, why don't we go out and do such and such? Or, hey, why don't we go this weekend and go to such and such? And all I'm wanting to do is decompress and not have a conversation with somebody. That's literally the goal. And I think a way that you do that is you've got, as a pastor specifically, you've got to build in organized specific times to open up your home. And I think you've also got to guard yourself from being overwhelmed by such things. So the first one, organized. I think it's a beautiful thing when a pastor opens up their home because for me, you know, I married this wonderful woman named Julia, and Julia had this great relationship as a college student with a pastor and his wife and their 4 kids. And through this relationship, she became almost like another family member. She was welcome to their house at any time, and honestly, she was there quite a lot. And through our relationship and our marriage, I got to know them very well too. And through that, you know, he's the guy that married us and all that. But it's a beautiful thing. And I don't know that I really even thought about it that way until I read this book.
Right.
And it was like a smoke flare someone shot into the sky, like, hey, you need to pay attention.
Right.
You need to not be lulled to sleep by your ordinary life. But also you've got to guard yourself because I know we're going to get to this, but your family is super important, especially if you have one, because Paul says it's easier for someone to do ministry who's single because when you have a family, you're responsible for them and their well-being.
Right.
So I think you can't overwhelm yourself by doing all of this hospitality. That being said, I think that there needs to be seasons where you're not as hospitable for your marriage and your family, whereas the majority of your life needs to be hospitality. So you need to go probably a whole year being hospitable before you start thinking, okay, I might want to take 3 or 4 weeks and just be with my family.
Right.
Because there's nothing wrong with that.
Right. People understand that.
But if you do the opposite and you say, I'm going to spend a year with my family and only 3 to 4 weeks after that being hospitable, I think you've got it backwards.
Right.
So, Will, let me put it back to you. So what are some methods to do this?
Well, I think the first thing that we need to think of is that we've talked a lot about the home, right? We've talked a lot about opening your home, coming and having lunch or dinner with you and your neighbors. But I also think that this can happen outside of your home. This doesn't have to be, you don't have to open up your doors and everybody come over for lunch in here.
Of course, yeah.
That doesn't have to be what happens. You can go as simple as praying, right? You can be, what you should be doing anyways. But I wonder, I think, you know, personally, how much I pray for the people around me, how much I pray for my neighbors. And I don't as much as I would like. I wish that I could tell you that I do a lot. But I really don't. And so I feel like it can start as little as praying for people, praying for your neighbors, praying, or prayer walking around your neighborhood, whatever that works for you. And then it can be simple things, right? So if somebody is struggling financially and they make that known to you, well, go buy their groceries for a week. Or every week, just go buy a lot more groceries than you normally do and say, hey, we have this, do you need this?
Right. And I think that that's how you develop relationships with people. So if you know that your neighbor down the street is struggling financially, or they've lost their job or whatever, or they've come up with some hospital bill, you can say, hey, I'm going to buy your groceries this week.
Right.
And that's a totally radical thought.
Right. Because nobody does that. Like,
Nobody.
Have you ever had anybody just buy your groceries?
No.
I don't.
I've had people buy my meals, but I've never had people buy my groceries.
Not like entire groceries for the month or for the week.
And to be clear, we are not asking people to buy our groceries on this podcast.
Yes,
that is
very
not
true.
what this is.
That is not.
But I think there's a place in Christianity that we feel as though the church should be the sole provider. People call the church all the time and say, hey, can you pay my electric bill? Hey, can you pay my, my grocery bill or my car payment? I'm in this rut or whatever. And which is great, and the church should do that. That's part of its role. But I think, like you said earlier, we're the church.
Right.
And why aren't we fulfilling some of these roles? And I think it's simply because we don't have personal relationships with a lot of these people that don't go to First Baptist Church.
Right. Right. So you can start as small as praying. You can do groceries. I think around Christmas time, maybe you and your kids cook some Christmas cookies, and then you pass them around to your neighbors. And what this does is, not only are you sharing the gospel by your acts, but this makes them more willing to come over for a lunch one day.
Right.
Because if I just get randomly invited to a lunch by a neighbor down the street, I'm probably, maybe a little sketchy about it. But if I know, hey, that was the neighbor with those two kids who came and brought us cookies during Christmas time, and they were really good cookies, and so I really want to go see what else that family's offering for lunch or dinner. They're more willing to come into your house and come and have that meal with you.
Right, right.
And so I think that's an important one. You can pass out food. There's so many. You can go mow the grass for your neighbor. You can go do any
it's
kind of.
It's honestly a really easy topic.
Right. Like, it's not that
we
difficult.
just don't do it.
Right. It's forgotten. But for some reason, it's not like you have to have some PhD to go out and practice hospitality.
Right, yeah.
This can be just for any everyday church members to go and mow somebody's grass, do the groceries. I know she talks about in the book how every morning she gets up super early and makes soup. She makes the exact same soup every single day, even the days that she thinks she doesn't know who's coming over. And I think that's the craziest part, is that she'll admit that the only things they have planned are really their lunches and dinners.
Right.
Other than that, they just have their door open and people just stop by.
Which is crazy.
People just come by. And could you imagine going home and just leaving your front door wide open and neighbors just stopping in?
Oh, man.
It pulls us so far out of our comfort zone.
That's a nightmare. But the reality is that that's what Jesus is calling you to do.
Right.
Which is crazy.
Like, do you think Paul called ahead and was like, hey, I'm coming to spend the night? No, he probably just showed up and was like, hey, I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm going to come stay. And so I think that's the craziest part. So she talks about, getting up early and cooking that soup. And when people come over, she automatically has a meal for them. Hey, well, while you're here, would you like a bowl of soup?
That is great.
Right.
That is great.
Regardless if she needs it, every day she says she gets up and cooks it. And so that it's just crazy to think about. So the point we're trying to get off here is that this isn't something crazy difficult to do.
Right.
This isn't something, like I said, you don't have to have a PhD. You don't have to have any kind of degree to practice hospitality. This is just something that we should be doing, and we're not.
Yes.
So our final question is, what does one whom lives with people that would not be okay with opening the doors of our house, would not be okay with anybody just coming in randomly, with having lunches and dinners, what does that person or maybe college student do with the family-wise that wouldn't be okay with hospitality?
I think it's hard for people to accept change in general. I think a lot of people are scared of change. They don't want change. They like the way that their life is. Not that that's a bad thing, but I think we get lulled into that type of lifestyle, and you can't just assume that you're like, you know what? I'm going to read this hospitality book, and I'm going to be more hospitable, and so is my husband. Well,
right.
Let's pump the brakes a little bit.
Right.
Any sort of change can't happen rapidly. I'd like to tell people that the church is like a giant freighter, like a boat, and you just can't turn that boat on a dime, because once you do, the boat's going to capsize, or all the stuff or people are going to fall off the boat. You just can't do that. That's why boats turn incredibly slowly. And if you're on the boat, it seems as though it's not turning at all, because you're in the sea. You have no idea where you're going.
Right.
And I think that's the same way with hospitality. And so if you're someone out there who's either living with their parents or with your spouse or maybe a roommate, it can be hard to get that person to be on board with your hospitality. And I think, I'm not saying you should be shady and trick them into hospitality, but you just wade into the water a little bit. Say, hey, I've invited so-and-so over for dinner. I know that you might not be comfortable with that, but they really need a meal and they need to be around somebody.
Right.
And as much as they'll moan and groan over it, most likely what happens is what happens in my own life is I'll moan and groan over it. And then when that person shows up to eat a meal or to have a conversation or even drink a cup of coffee, I love it.
Right.
Because I get to love on somebody and share Jesus with them. Even if I'm not shoving the Bible down their throat, I'm actively looking for moments and opportunities to share Jesus Christ with someone. And I think once you kind of take these little baby steps into hospitality, it becomes a lot easier to do.
Right. So you're saying start smaller.
Yes.
And
Don't
then
open up your house the day after you finish the book for
Right.
a whole week to anybody and everybody.
everybody in your neighborhood to
That's
come.
how you get your roommate to hate you,
Right.
Or your dad to kick you out of the house.
Right, because the reality is some of our college students live with their parents, or somebody who may be listening to this lives in a small apartment.
Right.
You know, and so like I mentioned, it doesn't have to happen in the home
Because it seems so overwhelming. You can
Right.
read this book, not that the book has a problem in itself, but you might read this book and go, man, this is so huge. This is so big.
Right.
I don't make that much money or anything. You could have all these thoughts. Like, I can't do this. Well, the reality is, no, you can't do it. You can't do it right off the bat.
Right.
It's something you've got to, and I think if Rosario was here right now, she would agree with that statement.
Right.
She would be like, yeah, you can't just start this.
Right.
You have to work hard and take baby steps and make sure everybody's on board. And then the moment where your husband or your wife says, hey, I need a couple days to myself, you do that.
Right. Well, she does it so well, but she's also been doing it for, gosh, I don't know how many years, but I'm sure quite a while.
Right.
And so, like you said, it's not, you can't just turn the ship on a dime.
Yeah,
and
I'm sure she
expect
was
everything
sitting
to
here.
change.
She wouldn't go, yeah, I got saved and I became the most hospitable
Right.
person on the
The
planet.
next day, my
The
family
next
was
day,
filled
totally
with
sanctified
neighbors.
and I'm ready to go. No, that's not what happened.
Right. No, I would agree. All right. And how we want to close here is I'm going to read you a paragraph out of her book. Eric is going to do the same, just kind of as a summary of the book as a whole. So mine's at the end of chapter 4. These far-reaching things go well with trust and lentil soup, with hot apple cider and fresh bread, with dog-walking, child-loving, and errating, with the asking of forgiveness and the seeking of second chances. The fall separated us from God, exposed us to God's curse, revealed the miseries of life, displayed the eternal pains of hell. The fall made us naked. Laughing this off as superstition or declaring on your own steam that my God wouldn't do that is fool's poker. Your God and mine did do it. We need to stop asking what Jesus, our imaginary friend, would do and start facing the deep shadow of the cross, because there at the cross we see what Jesus did do and how God provided the way of escape at his expense and for our blessing. But make no mistake, the way is hard. It breaks you. It is best walked in the company of other broken people, accompanying one another in suffering, helping each other repent of sin, bear the cross, and make biblical sense of things.
That's good. That's super good. So I'm not like Will, and I don't spoil the book, so I'm going to read out of the preface. And it's on page 13, and it says this: radically ordinary hospitality gives evidence of faith in Jesus' power to save. It doesn't get dug in over politics or culture or where someone stands on current events. It knows what conversion means, what identity in Christ does, and what repentance creates. It knows that sin is deceptive. To be deceived means to be taken captive by an evil force to do its bidding. It knows that people need to be rescued from their sin, not to be given pep talks about good choice making. It remembers that Jesus rescues people from their sin. Jesus rescued us. Jesus lives and reigns. Radical hospitality shines through those who are no longer enslaved by the sin that once beckoned and bound them, wrapping its allegiance around their throat, even though old sins still know their name and address.
All right. I think that's my favorite part about the book, is that she's not doing hospitality for hospitality's sake.
Right.
And
I think that's the main point.
Right. She makes that point all the time, is that I'm not doing this for myself, but I'm doing this to glorify Christ.
And if you are, that doesn't mean you should stop being hospitable. It means that you just need to refocus and say, listen, I do a lot of hospitality, but it might not be for Jesus.
Right.
So you've got to make sure in everything that you do, not only with hospitality, but with everything, you do so for Jesus.
Right.
You don't do it for yourself. You don't do it to make your neighbors feel great, but you do it for Jesus. And I think that's what makes this book incredible.
Right. So hospitality is not the hardest thing in the world, but it's something that we should all be doing, and we're currently probably not. You can pick up The Gospel Comes with a House Key anywhere that books are sold. Thank you for joining us on the Pastor and Intern podcast. We would like to thank FPC Blackshear for all they do in supporting us. Also, would like to thank Bruce Callahan for all he does for the podcast and us. Last but not least, we would like to thank you guys for listening to the podcast. It means more than you could ever imagine. Me and Eric have discussions all the time, one-on-one. If that's what this turns into, then there's no point. If you guys weren't listening, there would be no point. So thank you guys for listening. If you will please leave a rating and review, this will hopefully help more people see the podcast. Next week, we will be discussing the reliability of the Old Testament. Is it still important? Does it still apply to us today? And most of all, should we teach from it? Again, thanks for listening to the Pastor and Intern podcast.